What's up, fans? It's Ryan here, and I am joined on this week's Spotlight with former WWE superstar, the Space Lord, Victor. How you doing, Victor?
I'm good, Ryan. Thanks for having me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, doing pretty good. Thank you for agreeing to come on and be my guest for the Spotlight.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me. Like I said, appreciate it. It's been a while since I've done any podcasting with anyone.
Exactly. I'm excited. I'm excited to be talking to you and just getting in talk some wrestling. So when did you decide to get into the pro wrestling business?
Oh man, a long time ago now. I mean, when I was about I don't know, 16, I think, when I was in high school, it was kind of just like it was one of those things. Like I think when I grew up, I got into wrestling very young. Like I was probably like 5 or 6 years old when I started watching wrestling, and I'd moved to a small town, and my neighbors actually, like there was two or three boys, I can't remember, at the house that lived right next to me, and so they kind of all got me into it because we were all about the same age. And I mean, it kind of carried over because like I have some of my best friends still to this day that I had growing up, that I met when I was in like grade two. We kind of bonded because at the time we were all into wrestling, and
Right.
so that kind of carried over. It didn't happen like when I was a teenager. I think I dropped off from wrestling for a little bit, like
Mhm.
early teenage years. Suddenly, it wasn't cool anymore, which was actually right around the time where like WWF was going through all of their legal troubles and stuff like that, and so I got to miss all that. But then by the time just before the Attitude Era kind of came back, when I was about 15 or 16 years old, one of my best friends we started renting all the like old pay-per-views that we'd
Yeah.
never like watched or whatever and missed again. And so like me and all my friends kind of like just really got back into wrestling, and then the Attitude Era hit. And so I grew up in like a pretty small town in northern Alberta. Wasn't a lot going on there. And I mean, most of my friends wanted to be musicians or artists or something like that, which, I kind of wanted to do as well, but I wasn't on the same wavelength, I think, with stuff as a lot of other people. So like I could never really stay in a band or something like that. But like there was me and my that group of friends, we'd all still wrestle. Like even we'd go over to one of my buddy's place, and there was like, kind of tournaments and stuff like that for a little bit. But I'd always kind of done it. And it just got to the point where I was looking for a way to get out of the little town that I grew up in. I wanted to get out. I wanted to see the world, and I wanted to figure out something to do. And it just kind of came upon me where I was like, I maybe want to try wrestling. And so like that's kind of when the internet became available.
Right.
So I'd started looking for different places to go. And at that time where I was in Canada, like everything seemed like completely unreachable. Like, I mean, the schools that um, you could kind of find at that point in time were like Shawn Michaels was just starting up his school. And I think the Malenkos had a school, and like the Warrior had a school. And I was almost kind of dead set on going to Warrior's school because I was such a big fan of his when I was a kid. But like all of it was like unfathomable. Unfathomable. Is that the right word? For me to, yeah, to kind of achieve at that point in time. Like I didn't have the money to pay most of those, school fees. And moving to the States at that time didn't, I mean, it seemed impossible for me. I didn't really realize um, that I would be able to. So it took a couple of years until finally, like when I was about 18 years old, I had, Wrestling with Shadows had come out, and Stampede Wrestling had started up again, and a couple of my friends actually had both seen it on the local news. And so there was kind of like an advertisement on the news, and they gave the phone number. And so after, a couple of my buddies gave me the phone number for the dungeon basically. And it just kind of happened from there. Like it was, well, I mean, the first time I went to call was actually the night Owen Hart died. So
Oh
that was
wow.
what kind of sucked. So this was way back when, I was at work. I was working in a bus station at the Greyhound station at night, and I used to kind of run it at night by myself, doing night shifts at the time. And yeah, I'd been waiting to I was going to make the call because I knew how much money I think it was going to cost me or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but like, so that night I was going to call, and one of my buddies called me at work, and he was like, "Hey, were you going to call tonight?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was about to do that in the next half hour or something like that." Cause You use the work phone to get free long distance. And my buddy goes, "You might not want to call tonight." And then he told me what had happened. So I know I waited a couple months at that time for things to kind of settle with everything. And then eventually I reached out to Bruce, or who turned out to be Bruce. Uh, and I would have some interesting conversations with him. And like, it's funny because even as I started, once I got to the dungeon, I started meeting a couple other guys who had all started at the same time. We all had the same story of how like you'd call and like maybe Bruce would call you back because usually like nobody answered the first time you'd call, they'd call you back and it
Right.
was Bruce. But then like you'd get a call again, like I don't know, within the next week or something, and it would be Bruce again, but he'd be saying he was Ross. And so like even by the time like when I got down to Calgary and I was at a show and I like Ross was the first one I met and I was like talking to him immediately, I'm like, this is not the Ross Hart I was talking to on the phone. And then when I met Bruce, I'm like, this is the Bruce and Ross I was talking to on the phone.
Right.
And so, you know, none of us could ever really figure out why Bruce did that. You know what I mean? Like he did so many odd ribs. And I mean, it was just one of those things where it was like, right as you start, you're like, what is this wacky shit? You know?
Right.
But I mean, it was just kind of Bruce Hart. He was world renowned for being a ribber. So that was
Now,
kind of, mhm, go ahead.
did you have any like inspirations growing up? Being from Canada, did you have any like were you an Owen Hart fan?
Yeah.
Calgary kid?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like growing up, like I only really got to see WWF until about the Attitude Era, until like not about 96, because then TSN finally started kind of getting Nitro as well. Like I don't think we had TBS at first.
Right.
Because even I think when I did, like the only times I would occasionally catch like WCW Saturday morning or something like that. And it was on like really early on the weekend. So like I only saw it a couple times even as a kid. And like even, you know, my buddies we would watch or not watch, but like you'd get all the Pro Wrestling Illustrated and stuff like that. And you would see all the other things going on that weren't WWF, but like we would never actually get to watch any of it, you know, not until basically the Monday Night Wars kicked in, and then we got WCW on. Man, it was crazy at that time because you got Monday Night Raw on Monday, and then the same channel would play like Nitro on Tuesday, and then there was something on Wednesday, maybe at one point in time. I can't remember what it was, and then there was Thunder on Thursdays,
Right.
and then ECW was on Fridays on TNT. And so, I mean, like you know, all the Canadian wrestlers were definitely my heroes, like Brett and Owen and Benoit. Um, you know, those were three of my biggest influences, especially. And I mean, all the guys that came through Stampede were huge influences on me, like Dynamite and Davey and, you know, Pillman, all those kind of guys. I mean, because like I didn't even really get into like their full careers until I kind of started wrestling and started, you know, once the internet came about, we started having more access to like matches that were online and all that kind of
Right.
stuff. And I mean, those guys were all the hugest influences on me, you know, that I could say. But at the same time, like when I was growing up, my dad always liked the bad guys. So when we were
Mm.
watching wrestling, like he loved The Undertaker, he loved Razor Ramon. And like when I was a kid, I was like, I hate these guys, they're bad. And like as I got older, I'm like, oh, I see why these guys are so cool. Like
Yeah.
once the NWO happened, I loved NWO. Like it was so funny to me because as I grew up in that total Hulk Hogan, you know, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, that kind of deal. And when he was, you know, when he turned heel with the NWO, I loved it. And, you know, I saw that there was absolutely no difference in what Hulk Hogan did, good guy or bad guy. It was just the attitude that, you know, he portrayed. So, I mean, a lot of that influenced me in my younger days. And I mean, even when we used to watch stuff, I would always say, like, you know, like when you'd watch an outsiders match, you're like, wow, Scott Hall really works his ass off in there.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know, so I was with those things that like even, you know, before I started wrestling, like you really started to notice and stuff as I got older. And all those guys like that influenced me so much. And even once I got into more stuff within wrestling, like I mean, guys like Ted DiBiase and like Mr. Perfect used to really influence certain things that I would do. And I mean, Ted DiBiase, I only got to do something with him one time when he came into the performance center, and it helped so much. Like he was such a great guy to have in there, just with like a different viewpoint of stuff. And he was really awesome, to have to work with. So things like that were really what influenced me and my work more or less.
All right, awesome. And you mentioned training at the Heart Dungeon with Bruce and Ross Hart. What was that training like?
I mean, it was a lot of basics. I mean, I give Bruce and Ross both a lot of credit because they taught me how to protect myself 100% in the ring. And like Bruce used to always like kind of when he'd be teaching you something, he'd kind of like lead into it in a way where he was like, and it, because you have to do it this way to be safe. Don't let somebody else do it to you like this or like that. And he always had a story of how somebody basically tried to mess him up doing something, or somebody that did mess him up doing something. And I found out in later years from these same people why that happened. And it was always because he was such a ribber and people didn't really appreciate Bruce's ribs. And so
Right.
old school guys from, across the pond or wherever else, they didn't really take kindly to his form of ribbing them in his way. And so they'd usually try to mess him up. And
Mm.
so, you know, all in all, it kind of came around full circle as to where like he actually taught us very well how to protect ourselves on a lot of basics and stuff. And so training in the dungeon was really good for that. It was not easy. Like, I mean, we were not in a ring. We were on that basement floor, which had a bunch of deflated bicycle inner tubes under like an inch of foam that was kind of
Wow.
strapped in there. And most of the time, the thing that was holding it in tight, by the time I'd started, had kicked out. And so nothing was really held in super tight or safely anymore. And there would usually be a pretty big gap right in the middle of the mat where you were taking your falls and whatnot. And it sucked. Like it was hard, but it was like awesome. And because of that, like he trained me really like I give them a lot of credit for like the great basics that they trained into me. Like they kind of just like, got into me because then after about 3 years in the dungeon, um, there was a Japanese scout for New Japan who had been in Canada for about 30 years, Tokyo Joe, and he needed some boys to train with like TJ and Harry. Um, and he kind of took me and another guy in, and that was kind of what really polished my work more or less because then we went to work and that was like a real job. I mean, we
Right.
weren't like we were training 5 to 7 days a week depending on how soon it was that somebody was going to Japan, like if it was TJ going to Japan or if it was Harry going to Japan. And I mean, I got to go once and one of the other guys got to go once. And I mean, that was what really did it. I mean, like it was we were eating, sleeping, breathing, wrestling. Like I couldn't even go home and close my eyes without having dreams of this Japanese coach, like Tokyo Joe, yelling at me and all of us. And I mean, it was you almost hated him because he was such a hard coach. But then, like, if you'd have a bad day, like we used to even say, like, there's sometimes the three of us would be down there in the locker room afterwards, just like dead, and you'd be like, man, even if we wanted to try to kick his ass right now, and might add, he had one leg. He only
Right.
had one leg. We're like, even if we tried to kick his ass right now, like the three of us, because he'd piss us all off like so bad, like I'm pretty sure he'd still kill us. Like we were just like, and you'd usually go home and be like, fuck, I don't even want to think about wrestling for the rest of today. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want to think about him. And then he'd call you like 5 minutes later and be like, hey, come pick
Uh-oh.
me up. We'll go for dinner tonight. I'm going to buy you dinner. And he'd be like, all right, I guess. Like, we were all broke. None of us had any money. So when he'd take us out for dinner, you knew you were eating. So it was a good thing. And I mean, he would tell us like, hey, you boys, you think he'd use the word stern a lot and he'd be like, you think I'm stern on you? And we're like, yeah. He goes, yeah. And I mean, he would relate to his stories. Like he started in Japan when he was like 6 years old. He was going to be like a sumo wrestler and he could never get big enough to be like a big sumo wrestler. So like they knew that by the time he was a teenager. And so by the time he was a teenager, he'd started doing, martial arts and everything else. And then he started pro wrestling. And so he'd been a wrestler basically his whole life. And it was, such a different system. Like he'd be like, hey, I don't hit you guys. And we're like, yeah, thankfully. I mean, everything else sucks. Like we did so many, the workouts with him were hours long and brutal. And then you'd go wrestle for like hours and then you'd work out some more. And then finally you'd get, you maybe get to go for food and then go home. and die. So, but I mean, that really, between that and the dungeon, that was kind of what formed who I was as a wrestler, like having those two different influences. So,
Definitely, definitely, and you can tell that in how you perform, and that definitely molds you and helps you. And I'm sure it's totally different, like training in the dungeon versus training in the ring, because, like you said, you're not in an actual ring in the heart dungeon, and
yeah.
so you're
Well,
just
even
in
the
a
first
basement.
time, yeah, the first time we set up the ring in the yard, we were so excited in the summertime.
Mhm.
And there, I can't remember, it was a few of us. And so we like all set up the ring real quick one day and we're like, yeah. And Bruce goes, all right, back into the dungeon. And then we went in the dungeon and
Uh,
ran our drills and everybody was so pissed.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Do you remember your first match? And if so, what was that like?
Um, yeah. So like when I started with Stampede, they used to actually run like a bunch of little towns like in Alberta and Saskatchewan and stuff. And so after about 4 months, I think, of training in the dungeon, I found out that they were running these shows, and a couple of the guys who I'd started with were on the shows, and I was like, "Oh shit! Like, can we work on these shows?" And they were like, "Yeah, we don't know why you're not on them already. Like, we are." And we are like, so I asked Bruce, "Hey Bruce, can I go out on these shows?" Oh, sure, go for it, have fun, And so like, I think the first match I was just refing, like I refed one match, and then I think my first match was against a guy named Bill Yates. Um, I can never remember the town that it was in, but like I remember it pretty well because we were in like a hockey arena type of thing, but more like not like an NHL hockey arena,
Right.
a smaller one. And it actually went really well. That's all I can really remember. I had a lot of fun. I know I did a frog splash for like my first time ever, so I was super stoked. I was a young 19-year-old kid who was pretty excited to be wrestling. And I mean, we did a week's worth of shows, and I just had such a good time. Like it was awesome. I loved it. I was immediately hooked on road life, and I didn't kind of want to go home and go back to the normal way of things. Um, but yeah, it was just so much fun. Like I mean, I'm so thankful for that time I had in Stampede. I loved all the stuff we used to do, and because we used to travel quite a bit,
Mhm.
and even like as the years went on, like they maybe didn't do stuff all week, all the time, but like there was a we Stampede usually ran shows like anywhere from once a week to twice a month or whatever else it was. We had a pretty good steady following there in Calgary and everything. So it was awesome. I loved it.
That's that. I like that. That you can remember that first match, and it's like, uh, every time everyone I get on the podcast, there's all the first match. That's always an interesting story of like how it was like, or if they were just thrown into a match like last minute. It's just always such an interesting story. While we're talking about matches, if you could pick three matches in your career, what would those like as your favorite matches? What would those three matches be? I know it's a tough one.
Man, I almost never really think about it because I have a really hard time remembering a lot of stuff. But I mean, like one of my favorite matches ever was the ladder match I had with Von Lilas in OVW. Like that's always stood out to me as being one of my number one favorites and probably best matches that like always sticks out in my head. Like a lot of the matches, our last couple matches that we did on TV there. So we did like a no DQ falls count anywhere match that I really loved. And then we did the ladder match, which was really awesome, and I loved that one too. And then after that, man, I don't know. The weird thing is like I can't remember a lot of stuff that I did in NXT, and like it just all seems like a blur because like we were doing so much all the time that like I mean, there was a few matches that like stick out to me that were like great live event matches. Like there was a point in time where Connor and myself were working like so many like new guys coming up or the
Right.
guys who had been there for a little bit and just like they hadn't found their traction yet with stuff. And so like we worked guys like CJ. I can't remember what he goes by now. He's in New Japan. I can't remember if it's as CJ or something else. But like him and Jason Jordan. Like we used to work them as like a hot babyface tag team. And we used to have some awesome matches with them. Like I wish I could remember some of the stuff we used to do with them because the matches were so good. And both of those guys had so much great fire that at that time, even though we were building, what Ascension was at that time. I can't remember if we were even champions yet, but when we would work them, they were two of the only kind of guys that could really have enough fire and what they were doing to like kind of be able to like have great matches with us, like so that they weren't just squash matches with them, which is what that was always what me and Connor wanted to do, was have great fucking matches with everybody and not just do squash matches with young guys
Right.
that, maybe couldn't lace their boots yet and whatnot, which, isn't always that easy.
Mhm.
Um, so like those stand out to me because I always remember those ones. I guess one of the first times we went back to NXT, we got to work with Gable and Jordan, and that match always stands out to me as a lot of fun. Like I really enjoyed that one. And other than that, I mean, yeah, there's nothing that like I can say that completely stands out to me because there's so many different times where I mean, there's things that I remember, and it's usually like me looking across the ring at Brody and laughing about something, or Joe Hennig making us all laugh about something. Um, Little things that like the fans wouldn't even know, but that was always just in between us. Um, Stuff like that. Like I can remember one of our Euro tours, we were in Spain or something like that, and it was one of the last days of the tour, and we made it Super Kick Sunday. And so we were trying to make everybody throw a super kick in their match.
I
And
love that.
everybody did. And then Randy Orton was in like the main event against somebody. And we're like, there's no way Randy's going to throw a super kick. And sure enough, Randy threw a super kick.
Wow.
So it was hilarious. Like it was so much fun. But I think that was by the time when they first did the draft.
Mhm.
And when they did that first draft with us when we were there, that SmackDown crew was awesome. Like it was just the best crew that I could have worked with, while we were up there because everybody was so on the same page and kind of in the same positions no matter what. And it just really came together. So it was a lot of fun. So it's stuff like that that I remember.
I like that. I like the approach you took with that. Because it can be hard to come up with your favorite matches, and so I
Yeah.
like the approach you took with that. Great answer right there. What was your time in Stampede Wrestling like?
I mean, it was great. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better starting place. Like, I think if anything, I just got to learn so much because there was a lot of people, different people that would come through when Stampede started, and so it was a very awesome introduction into the business because we had so many carny people coming through that were usually just trying to like get themselves on the shows in one way or another. And Bruce would use them and abuse them, and it was always kind of like interesting to see the characters. Not, there was just so much. Uh, there was so much wackiness in Stampede Wrestling kind of behind the scenes and even out on the show. Like Bruce used to just send some guys out repetitively every match. Like there'd be certain managers, he'd just be like, no, you're out with these guys. And like people would be trying to come back from their matches and Bruce would be like, no, get back out there and cut a promo on whatever. And they were like, oh, I don't even know what to say. And then they'd have to go out and do whatever. Um,
Wow.
but I mean, it was really awesome. Like I got to spend time with Stu and talk with him here and there, and which was so awesome to me. And it was funny because he never stretched me. Like whenever I'd shake his hand, he'd be like, yeah, you remind me of, I can't even remember who he would say now because it was somebody different every time. And he'd always say my hands reminded him of somebody, and then he would tell me a story about him, and then he would, whoever was standing next to us, he would grab them. Like he would never grab me to do something. He'd grab the person that was next to me and always do something to them and kind of put them in a hold and whatnot. So that used to always make me laugh because I was like, why doesn't he ever try to mess me up? He's always messing up whoever's next to me. You know what I mean?
Right.
Um,
Right.
so I mean, there was all that kind of stuff with Stampede was just it was so much fun. Like, and even when I left, like I'd kind of worked there for about 7 years before I ever moved to Louisville, and I had just started kind of traveling uh, that little bit more because I'd gotten in a tour of Japan and a tour out in England for All Star Wrestling
Mhm.
by like 2005, 2006, and then I think Stampede kind of shut down for a little while I was away. I think the last time in England, and so then they had to so a different I think one of the other guys bought it, like somebody that had been working with the company for a while, and so they kind of took it under their wing and they kind of restarted it for a little bit right before I left the OVW. So I mean, all of it, like there's so many great people that were all involved with Stampede Wrestling that I probably haven't kept as good in touch with over the years as I should have. But I mean, it was just an all around great experience. Like, I mean, there wasn't much that I didn't learn about the business to help prepare me going forward for once I got to America and to OVW and everything else. So,
It definitely sounds like it was a great experience right there. Um, Now you mentioned New Japan in December and or in November and December of 2003. You would do a tour with New Japan Wrestling under the name The Shadow. What was it
yes.
like working New Japan?
I mean, it was awesome. I mean, it's funny now that I remembered that because my match with Tenzan was probably one of my favorite matches that I can kind of remember. I guess I just don't think about it often, but I mean, it was such a huge, huge difference in worlds. You know what I mean? Like I was a legit indie wrestler from Canada, you know, doing these little buildings for Stampede Wrestling, like you know, working it out of legions and halls, community halls, stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, you get a chance to go to New Japan, and I mean, first thing, your flight's paid for. I had a contract for a ton of money, what seemed like the giant, hugest pile of money I'd ever seen in my life at the time. And you know, even just getting there, like you get picked up for the plane and you get on a bus, and the next thing I know, I'm on a bus with, you know, Josh Barnett, Scott Norton, and Brian Danielson. And who the hell am I? But luckily, I'd actually met Brian before because we'd worked at a company in Vancouver, British Columbia before, and he beat the crap out of a guy that I had trained with forever. So we'd kind of known each other a little bit from that, and you know that kind of formed our friendship because we were the two young guys out there in New Japan. But I mean, they all helped me a lot. Norton was such a huge help to us young guys, and just conduct ourselves and stuff like that. But it was a dream come true. I've honestly, that's one place I've missed every day since I left it. Like when we were there, you know, I was there for about 21 days. And I remember the last week, everyone kept asking me, like, are you homesick? Are you homesick? And I was like, no, no, I'm good here. You know, and it was like, you know, I missed my family and stuff like that. But I was like, man,
Right.
I don't know if I'm going to get to come back here. So I want to, you know, I love every moment that I had there. Like it was so much fun. The wrestling was, um, so much different than you know what we were dealing with in Canada, just on such a gigantic level. Like I couldn't believe one night when I got back to the hotel, and I've always been somebody that likes to turn on foreign television, even if I can't understand it, and just flip around and
Same.
see what's on. And one night I happened to see myself on television, and I could not believe it. You know, it was literally, I mean, you know, it was just here I was a young kid, and I'm in Japan now. I'm watching myself wrestle on television in Japan against some of their biggest stars at the time, and even to this day, still. So, I mean, like I said, I still wish I could be there, but I don't think my body would hold up much anymore, and the way they work. So,
That is absolutely very cool, and it's cool to say that you got to be a part of New Japan
yeah.
in that way. That's very cool. How did your time in OVW come to be? And you would debut in Derby City Wrestling, which was like the developmental, I guess you could say, for OVW. You
Yeah.
debuted in a 30-man battle royal under the name Apocalypse.
Hmm. Um, so it was actually my girlfriend at the time had gone to one of the tryouts that they used to hold at the time while I was away in England. And so she had kind of gotten accepted to go to OVW. And I didn't actually have much interest in going there at the time. The stories that I heard weren't particularly good. Like if you weren't assigned, you know, contract person or like invited to be there, it wasn't really I mean, the people that I talked to just had their experiences, and so that
Right.
was what I'd kinda gotten back, and I didn't really have that much interest in it. But when I got back, I think she had wound up getting hurt, so she came home for a while, And then I think Stampede kind of stopped running for a bit, and I didn't really know what else to do. Like, in all honesty, I was trying to figure out a way to get into the States. Like, I can't remember if I'd gotten my citizenship yet by the time I went to do those few ROH shows that I did for a couple months. Like, I went down to Philadelphia. Brian invited me to um, come stay with him. And because that was just when he had started running the ROH school at the time. So I went and stayed with him for a bit. I did some shows and stuff like that for about 6 weeks. And then I think when at that time was when my girlfriend then had moved out there. So I think I'd helped her move to like Louisville. And then I went and did some stuff in Philadelphia, and then I went home. And I think then she got hurt, maybe. I have a hard time placing everything timeline wise. But so then after that, I just didn't really have anything going on. And I was like, man, I can't sit here and do nothing if I want to be a pro wrestler. And so I managed to get my citizenship. Like, my dad was American, so I'm lucky enough to have dual citizenship. And once I kind of got that all sorted out, I was like, well, I'm going to go to OVW. And I remember, like, I called Rip probably the week before I moved down. Like, I'd already planned to move down, and I knew how much I had to pay him and all that kind of stuff. And I just called him and I was like, hey, Rip, like, I'm so and so or whatever. And he was like, oh, yeah, your girl had told me about you or whatever. I was like, yeah, so I'm going to be moving down there next week. Is it cool if I like join? And he was like, yeah, this is how much money it costs, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, I know. He's like, all right, well, whatever, bye. And he just like hung up the phone on me. Like, he'd never expected to see me. And so then the next week I showed up. And there we were. And I mean, the rest of that is history. I mean, DCW is something I used to get so pissed off sitting there at the beginning of DCW. I did not enjoy it. And it's kind of funny to say that now, but I think it was just, dude, we had so many people in DCW, and so there was only, like an hour time slot or whatever, which actually isn't a full hour on television, and most of it kept getting, it was dedicated to more characters than it was wrestling,
Right.
because I think at that time we probably had more characters than wrestlers, and it took a little while until um all the wrestlers and with the characters started to really like show up in it. But by that time, WWE was pulling out. And so DCW basically just became OVW. But by that time, I mean, a lot of people I think had grown into who they were going to be. Like, that was when I stopped being Apocalypse and I became APOC. So it was like,
Yeah.
throw away the cape and Karn Alexander and put on a hat, and me and Von Lilas got thrown into a tag team together. And I remember he doesn't remember this, but I say we used to always fight after every match. Like, for the first while, like, just he would start ripping into me about something and I just tell him to fuck off. Because I didn't give a shit about whatever his opinion was. And then in class, I used to beat him up, and Rip would get mad at me and be like, he's just a volleyball player. You know that? He used to just play baseball and basketball. He ain't a wrestler. He doesn't know how to shoot like you. And I'm like, that's what makes it funner. And so it was, there was a lot of that. And I mean, DCW in the time, like, there was so many awesome people. That's for sure. Like, there's a list of characters when I go through my mind, like when I look at the old pictures of the groups and stuff, it's just like amazing. The amount of characters and stuff that were there. And even by the time I got signed, when I used to sit there in promo classes with Dusty Rhodes, all I could think of a lot of the time was how many of those people I'd worked with in OVW and DCW that should have been sitting there next to me in FCW, like, especially in promo class, not just to mention, people's in-ring work and stuff like that. There was so many good, amazingly talented guys. And obviously that's what helped keep the place open, and that's what helped get it to where it is now. And so I'm happy to see that, like, we managed to help keep it there during those times, because I know it was like, it's tough times when WWE pulled out, because I mean, none of us were making any money. Danny was paying the bills for the building out of his own pocket, that kind of thing, and we managed to turn that around for him. So
Exactly. It was some good times right there.
mhm.
What was it like working with Karn Alexander, who is also an alumni of this podcast, as a tag team under the name Eric Doom? And what was behind the decision of going from Apocalypse to Eric Doom,
That
and
was not
then later
that was
back to Apocalypse?
That was not my decision. That was Al Snow's decision. Um, Al Snow did not like the name Apocalypse, so he decided to call me Eric Doom.
Mhm.
So it was actually funny because by the time he started using me on OVW, I was on DCW every week with Karn. And so I can remember like seeing like the main event one night of like DCW, and it was I can't even remember who I was working, but obviously, it was me with Karn and whoever. I can't remember if Fang was with us yet at the time. But then like it flips over to OVW like right afterwards, and I was on the first match like probably against like Thorn or somebody, and it was it went from me being Apocalypse to being Eric Doom. It was the exact same character, like it was no difference. So I'm like, this is fucking stupid. But that was Al's choice. But I mean, working with Karn, uh, I laugh now because I was probably a huge dick to Karn at the time. But I mean, really, like, I think it was just because I saw so much of my immaturity, I think, in him. Like, he was still so innocent and, like, just that total, he was like the newer, I want to say, like, emo kid, I guess,
Yeah.
like at that time, because he was a younger kid. He was in all the dark stuff and, he was just very eccentric with things. And so, like, when we all got paired together and like Bin Hamid gave us the idea because he was doing most of the writing and stuff for the show. And he gave us the idea of like having me carry or lead Karn out with a chain. You know what I
And
mean?
yeah.
Like have him in like the dog collar or whatever. So like we said to Karn, like, hey, go get a chain um, so that I can lead you out in it. And I mean, he finds the biggest, heaviest chain he could possibly find to wear around his neck. And like when he showed it to me, I'm like, you realize you have to put this on. Like I'm going to be dragging you around with this on. He was like, yeah. And I'm like, well, you did it to yourself, man. I mean, we had fun. I mean, I really did actually enjoy the stuff that we did together. And it started helping me definitely define my character and who I was at that time. Like it started helping me get heat and stuff like that. And then we did Fang in a Bag, which was a lot of fun. Um, I mean, I enjoyed all that stuff. Like there was definitely times where my ego got the best of me because I wanted to just be a wrestler and just be a serious wrestler, even though I had this big giant cape on and I was called Apocalypse. Um, but I didn't want to be as much of a character as I wanted to be a wrestler. And I think that started helping me a lot become the character. So
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. And that chain, by the way, was long. Oh my
yeah, yeah.
gosh. How did you find out you would be paired to work in a tag team with Von Lilas?
Joey Mercury just put us together. I mean, that was literally it. Like there was as WWE was pulling out from OVW, so like Joey, Nick Dinsmore, Rob Conway, and Roadkill were all kind of there to help. I mean, salvage what was there more or less. And so Joey had kind of picked me and Von Lilas to like work with for some reason, like which seemed odd. Like I honestly had almost no interaction with Von Lilas before this point. I'd probably been there for like a year or something. Like I can't remember exactly, but it was probably about a year. And so when that finally happened, he just kind of threw us together. And he was like, "You guys are going to be a team. You guys are going to be the world beaters." Blah blah blah. And we're like, "All right, let's see what we can do." And I mean, like I said, the first month or so that we were working together, I was pretty sure we got in arguments after every one of our matches until we just clicked. I mean, that was kind of just how it happened. I just figured out what he did, figured out what I did. And even now, when I watch some of our matches back, I'm like, man, he is one mean ass bastard in the ring of these kids we were working with. Like, I'm the one that put on my Scott Hall shoes and had to go to work, and then he'd get in and just chop the shit out of everybody and get out. I'm like, great, thanks. Now I got to, go to work, dick.
Right.
So, but yeah,
We talked
that's.
about those chops last week when I was
Mhm.
recording with him, and oh my gosh, those chops.
Yeah, he had real big hands. Like I used to remember one of the old OVW, like, Von Lawless always did this, and like his hands are gigantic. And the older ladies there that had been around forever, used to always call them fingers.
Fingers, yeah,
You know
Donna
that
and
used
Mary, yeah.
Yeah, it always make me laugh. So
Um, what did it mean to you to become one half of the OVW Southern Tag Team Champions two
I
times?
mean, that was really something for me. I mean, um, it's funny because like I guess like that was the first time I felt like that was something like that people were paying attention to or should have paid attention to. I was really proud like when we got those titles and the way we carried them and stuff. And it was the first time I'd really kind of been attached to something. Just because after being at OVW for the time I'd been there, really learned the history and seen who'd held those titles and where they'd come from. And so it was really awesome. Like, I mean, that was one of the first things I ever really wanted to hang my hat on and be like, holy shit, I did this, you know? So yeah, it was a really big deal to me. Um, yeah, and we were pissed when we lost too. We were not happy about it.
I can imagine. But that's pretty cool to, like you said, talk about the people that held them before you did. That's
Hmm.
great lineage right there.
Yeah.
Um, can you talk about your feud with uh, your former partner Von Lilas and over the OVW Heavyweight Championship, and then being the two-time OVW Heavyweight Champion, and then dropping the belt later to Lowrider?
Uh, yeah. I mean, so that was, I like when I think about it, mine and Von Lilas's feud with each other when we started feuding over the OVW heavyweight title was probably some of the best stuff I can remember myself ever doing, especially as like a singles performer. Um, but I mean, our matches, I used to just love them. Like we would beat the shit out of each other, and like just the reactions we were getting um, were very. It was a very fulfilling time for no reward, more or less, kind of thing. Because like all of us at OVW were trying to just stand out and get a job. Like that was what
Right.
all of us wanted. We wanted OVW to succeed and keep the doors open and fill the arenas, and we all wanted to get a job. And so there was no lack of determination around that place. So everybody was pushing each other all the time, and everybody was trying to have the best match possible and in the best way possible because obviously there was so many different types of talents around. And so when me and Von Lilas finally got to fight, we already had that kind of natural animosity with each other from how long we had worked together as the tag team, and then nobody else to kind of um, argue with other than ourselves about things. And so it always made, I just felt like it always gave us like an extra feeling when we were working with each other. And I loved all the stuff that we did. Like that's why I say like the two last matches I can remember us having was the no DQ falls count anywhere match and then the ladder match. And I was the one that actually pitched the ladder match. And Danny didn't want us to do it. Rip didn't really want us to do it. And I don't think Von Lilas really wanted to do it. And I just said like, look, I'll take care of you in there. We'll be okay. And then of course he gets Bell's palsy or whatever, which he still kind of blames me for after that match. But I mean, it was just, I mean, to me, it's still one of my favorite times. And after like when he got sick, like I remember being at the shows that weekend after the ladder match, and we were out back in E-Town, Elizabethtown, Kentucky. We were standing out back behind the building. We just watched his face like just get paralyzed right there in front of us and droop, and we're like, what the hell is going on? And so I mean all of that was super heartbreaking because he couldn't work anymore at the time. And uh so like that was kind of why I became the two-time OVW champion, was because he had lost the title, or I mean he'd won the title from me, kind of ending our feud, and then we didn't really know where to go with anything with the company. So I just tried to pull the biggest heel move I could in getting that title back, so that then we could make the transition to go to a bit, have it go to a baby face because I'd obviously been champion long enough doing stuff. And I was kind of trying to leave at that point in time. Like I didn't know what else there was for me to do. I think I'd had a tryout at FCW at that time, and I can't remember if I knew already. Like it took him a while to turn me down for some reason. Um, and so when it came time to try to figure out who was going to be next and whatnot. They put Lowrider in that spot, and Lowrider was cool. Like I always got along with Lowrider. I mean, I we worked him a bunch. He was in a tag team with I can never
Raul.
remember like yeah, Raul.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to always call him Cheese. I can never remember his like real name, but I always loved working with him. So I mean, like we'd already worked with each other and stuff, and I just knew whatever I was bringing to the table with Lowrider was not the same. It wasn't the same energy that me and Von Lilas had by any means. And I think whatever I was trying to do to help him, I don't feel like I really accomplished it by the time he won the title. I know Cornette tried to do some stuff with him after I'd left and whatnot, and I can't really remember how any of that went. But I just remember most of the stuff I tried doing with him did not work. And I don't blame that on him or anything. I just don't think, since I was kind of booking at that time, I don't think I just did it the right way. I mean, I don't know, but it wasn't, the payoff for it wasn't as good. And I was probably still just like disappointed with everything that had happened with Von Lilas in the end. So, I mean, like my way out of OVW, I remember having a few really good matches, with him and with Chad Collier and with Mike Mondo and like stuff like that is what I kind of remember, at the end of it that I really loved and enjoyed. Like I was really felt like I was firing on all cylinders most of the time, except for in the matches with Lowrider for some reason. Um, yeah, like I loved that stuff. It was all awesome.
Yeah, I remember going back, like just thinking in my head just now. I remember the promo after Vaughn had got Bell's palsy, and it was
Right.
an in-ring promo, I believe, on a Wednesday night at a taping, and uh, you were both in the ring, and I think you turned on him at that point. You was like he was holding his hand up in there. I think I even have a picture of it on my Facebook somewhere, and you had raised his hand, and then you had turned on him, hit him with the belt, and then like the a ref came out and made a pin. You made the pin or something like that. I think that's how
Mm.
that went down. And so
Yeah, I know I really tried to
I always loved
babyface
that.
it, and I was really kind of upset with how we had to do it.
Mm.
I mean, because I know that was one of those times where like I really thought about what I was going to say and how we were going to do it, and really putting in a lot of the reality of what we had gone through into it. And I mean, I haven't watched that back in forever, but I remember I wanted to come off as the biggest piece of crap to the people there and for the situation, just because I was like, I don't like how we have to do this, but I think this might be the best way to do it going forward. Um, so yeah, it was one of those things. I can't remember if it was that same promo. There was one where Timmy Baltimore was interviewing me at the time, and he t- he told me to say this to him because I would never say this, but he had told me to like just tell him to like shut up and get out of the ring, or I would finish doing the job that God didn't do to him, or something like that.
Oh
I was
no!
like, wow, that is about the worst thing that you can say
Right.
to you on the microphone. He's like, right, so say it to me, and I was like, all right. So I can't remember if that was the same one and if that was how that had started or not. But that stands out to me quite a bit still.
I like that you shared that. Um, who are some of your favorite people to work with in OVW?
I mean, Von Lilas for sure. Um, Eric Matlock was really awesome. I used to love working with him. I know he was Rudy Switchblade,
Mhm.
is I think what he used to run as, and I know he had a pretty good run after I left. Like he became OVW champion and stuff. Um, man, totally awesome. Like both Stuzio and Jimmy. They were really awesome to work with. I loved working with Jamin. I used to always have really good matches and fun stuff with Jamin. Adam Revolver was another amazing guy to work with that was there. So I'm glad to see that he's finally getting some recognition through all the stuff with them on Netflix. And I mean, I was there when Truth Magnum got his start at OVW, and I mean his very start, and that kid went through some insane shit, let me tell you. So I'm very happy that now here we are about 15 years later, and I get to see him on the road here and there, and I'm just happy to see those guys, both him and Turbo Floyd, doing their
Floyd, yeah.
thing. I mean, I never got to meet Floyd until about a year or two ago, and so that was super awesome. I mean, there was one guy that I always loved working with. We didn't by far have the best matches, but I got a brewski was one of my favorites to ever
Yeah,
see in OVW, and to watch just seeing him in public was hilarious. I mean, and then there was like Moose, and he was another one we used to have some fun with. And I mean, just so many characters. You know, I loved working with Fang. Fang in a Bag was so much fun. Damian Adams, he was another one that I used to love working with. Like, he's so easy and so good, and like I'm so happy to see like what he's been able to do with his school out in Jersey and stuff like that, and the amount of talent that he's pumped out and still being in the business. And we got to work, I don't know, probably 2 years ago now in Outlaw Pro Wrestling, and it was just hilarious because like me and him, were, too busy shooting the shit and catching up to really worry about our match, and then we go out and work, and it was like we hadn't missed a day. So I mean, there's so many guys back there. I just OVW was a really good time. We had so much work. I mean, I always look at it as the time when we were there was like the best worst time you could have, because everybody was so determined to try to keep OVW around, trying to get a job. But nobody was making any money. Everybody was super miserable because of how poor we all were. But everybody really managed to lift each other up a lot of the times. Like, there was definitely a lot of bullshit that always goes on kind of backstage, certain politics and stuff like
right.
that. But I mean, everybody kind of overcame that together, and
Mhm.
it was a real family there. Like, even now, if I meet guys who have come through OVW afterwards or who were there before, it's always like a real easy way to kind of like see who somebody is. You know what I mean? And you almost always have that connection right away, where it's like, oh, I was in OVW, at this time and blah blah, or afterwards, and that kind of thing. So I mean, it was, I'm forever thankful and grateful for my time there.
Definitely, definitely. It was good times right there, and that crew, even after WWE had pulled out,
Oh,
being a fan of OVW, as long as I've been going to shows there and everything, that crew there was just at that time was just as good as the developmental crew that was there
oh
before
yeah,
you.
100%.
And so,
And it
yeah,
was like, I mean, I'm one of these guys who I love wrestling that's funny. Like, I'm a big comedy guy, but usually like only if it's done properly, you know?
mhm,
And I mean, so I can remember one time I watched a match between Man Beast and Ryback where
mhm,
they did a fucking banana spot that was one of the probably the best things I've seen in wrestling in
right,
a long in a long time, still to this day, just because of how well it was done.
mhm,
And I mean, that was something that was so awesome about OVW, was like those characters and just how Rip and Danny were able to make people, you could have that kind of fun but still be serious wrestlers at the same time. And that was such a
exactly,
great thing about OVW and all of that cast there. Like, so they would, Rip was so amazing at being able to, he was like the Paul Heyman of accentuating people's silly characters and how best to use them for it, and then working with what they were best at in the ring with that, even if they weren't the greatest technical wrestler or whatever. And so it was such a great, I mean, that crew was just so awesome for being able to like blend all of those things together and come together and work together.
yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. In 2011, you would sign a WWE developmental contract and be sent to FCW. What was your time in FCW like, and how did that time come to be?
Hmm. Well, I thought I was going to get fired every day for about the first 3 months. That's kind of how I expected that to go. I mean, when I got hired, so I'd had my tryout and they turned me down after about a month. Um, there's kind of like a big long story that goes into that. Um, Regardless, they just didn't hire me. I went home for a year and I was doing some other stuff, but I was kind of at the end of my rope, more or less. Like, I was about to turn 30. I'd just lost. I mean, I'd had a really good paying job being kind of like an arborist, like a tree doctor type gimmick. And I just lost the job because the seasons were changing. Like, it was about to be winter time. And so like the company would send people out to different provinces. Like, they wanted to send me to Saskatchewan or something like that. And I was like, well, I've got one last shot coming up kind of thing. Like I was like, WWE is going to be here in Calgary and Edmonton, like at this time. I was like, so I need to be here for that. This is kind of my last opportunity type of thing. So the company laid me off, and I was short of even getting like unemployment or anything like that because I just hadn't worked there for like a day or two, like
Right.
of the requirement of it type of thing. Like I was just like a couple days short. Um, and anything I'd done in Canada since being home, like either was no longer running or just wasn't like it wasn't exactly filling the void or filling my wallet more or less. Like I think while I was there, like maybe 4 or 5 months before that WWE tryout or before I went to work as an extra and got hired, I'd been in a bad car accident. Like
Mm.
we were coming back from because we would drive out to Winnipeg to do WFX shows, I think is what it was called. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I used to see a bunch of guys from OVW there and stuff like that, and it was awesome. We had a great time, but we used to drive 12 hours. Me and a guy named Andrew Hawks,
Mm.
and we used to drive usually 12 hours there, get to the arena at like noon, and then you'd film the show, and then usually you'd stay over, and then go back the next day, drive your 12 hours back to Calgary or whatever. But this one night, there was a group of us that were going to try to make it back to Calgary for some shows the next day. And we wound up rolling our car at like 6 in the morning. So by that point in time, when I had that tryout, right, it wasn't even a tryout. I was just booked as an extra. I was really like, man, I don't know what I'm going to do anymore. Like we didn't even get to do anything being extras. Like we rolled around in the ring a little bit on Monday, but nobody was paying attention. Like we'd done a little bit with Regal or something like that. But it wasn't one of those times where they were really taking a look at the extras for anything. And so at the end of, the Tuesday night or whatever it was for SmackDown, I'd been prodded by Natty to go talk to Johnny Ace. And I was like, I don't even know what to say to him. Like, what am I going to do? Go say thank you for having me around, giving me a paycheck again for a couple days? Like, that's more or less what I was thinking. And then I kind of got, when I went to knock on his door, I more or less got sucked into like, here's your 5 minutes with Johnny Ace. Tell him why he should hire you. And I was like, man, what am I going to say to you now that like you don't already know? More or less, I had never been very good at putting myself over. More or
Mm.
less, like I just kind of let my talent speak for itself. I let what I do speak for itself. I know there'd been some issues with people supporting me, which didn't, I mean, caused me to not get hired when I had my tryout. Um, and so I knew that he knew who I was at least.
Right.
And I mean, the things that he asked me, he was like, "Did you bring me a new promo package with like any new matches and stuff like that?" And I'm like, "No." I'm like, "Why would I? Like, you don't watch that shit." And he was like, "What?" And I was like, "Yeah, I know nobody watches any of that stuff. Like, what do you need a picture of me for? I'm standing here in front of you. Like, I
Right.
did, I'd cut my hair and shaved, which is something they had asked. They'd said they didn't like my look before, and so I'd done all that stuff. And I was like, I'm sitting there, in a suit, like in front of Johnny Ace that I'd spent like my last $500 on type of thing at the time. And he basically just shit on me for about 5 minutes straight, telling me why, I shouldn't be hired or, whatever. And it literally, I tuned out like halfway through it because I was so sick of wrestling. Like I dealt with him a few times as an extra, and I was just always in awe at how much he liked to put himself over to people that didn't really like need to hear that kind of shit, more or
Mm.
less. Um, but so I just kind of tuned out and I was like, man, what am I going to do when I leave here? I'm not wrestling again. It's like I'm tired of dealing with assholes like this and the way that the business is. I was like, if this is what it is up here, I was like, I don't even want to be a part of this shit. Like this sucks.
Right.
And so as I kind of tuned back in to whatever he was saying, it
Mm.
ended with, so if you were me right now sitting here, kid, why would I hire you? And I mean, I didn't waste a second. I said, I wouldn't. You obviously don't want to. And there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to change your mind. Like, what do you want me to say? Hire me because I'm good looking? Or, I can't even remember what I said. It was like, you're not going to. So, what's the point? I just sat there staring at him. And I'll never forget because he just kind of like looked at me like real puzzled for a second. He looked at the floor, looked back up at me. He looked at Ty Bailey. And he goes, Ty, give this kid a job. He stood up and he said, welcome to WWE, kid. And shook my hand and walked out the door. And I was like, what the fuck just happened?
Right.
Sorry for cursing on your show.
But you're good.
It's kind of what happened. And Ty Bailey looks at me and he goes, wow, you caught him in a good mood. You're lucky. I'm like, that was a good mood? Like, that didn't seem like a good mood to me. And,
Right.
you know, years later, Johnny Ace, I will say, was one of my favorite producers to work with. So, I mean, after he was no longer Vince's right-hand man, there was a huge personality change in that man. And I never had to deal with that version of Johnny Ace again. So that was pretty cool.
That impersonation was pretty good, I have to say. And yeah,
He's an easy one, especially with my post-COVID voice that I still have.
I understand that was really good impersonation. But no, yeah, just sitting here hearing you tell that story, it was like, yeah, that was my thought process there. Like, what? Like, really? You hired me? Like, what? Like,
Yeah.
what just happened? Um, how did you come up with the name Rick Victor? Or did they give you the name? Or
No, so in all honesty, that was one of those it was one of those FCW things where they're like, give us a list. Like they would say like give you like 5 names or something like that. And I can't remember what the names were I picked. But none of them clicked. And I remember going over them with Matt Martellero, and I knew I wanted something like I liked the name Victor, but this was at the time where they were like determined that everybody had to have a first name and a last name. And I can't like I can just remember like thinking like me and Martellero were sitting there and we're like, well, there's something with Victor because I wanted to use V actually in tribute to Von Lilas because like a lot of people would call him V. So like I wanted to be able to have a V logo specifically for him.